On today's podcast, we sit down with the great one and only Vicky Hamilton. Vicky, as you well may know, is the music business executive, artist manager, and she was also the author of Appetite for Dysfunction, which was a memoir of her life as a young woman, leaving the Midwest to come to California to pursue her music dreams. She was the woman who got Guns N' Roses their deal. She nurtured the band, she helped them, she got them signed. She also worked with a lot of other seminal hard rock bands at that time. So we talked about that era, we talked about different bands, we talked about that scene, we talked about being a woman in the music business that's very, very male dominated, especially in that era in the hard rock scene, and a lot more. You're not going to want to miss it. Insiders, are you ready? Welcome to MUBUTV's Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we sat down with Vicky Hamilton, veteran music business executive, artist manager, and author of Appetite for Dysfunction, a memoir of her life as a young woman leaving the Midwest to come to California to pursue her music dreams. We discuss her early years in LA, the music scene, working with many seminal hard rock bands, and discovering and helping put together the legendary band Guns N' Roses, and much, much more. You won't want to miss it. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Insiders. Are you looking to take your music career to the next level? Then you need to know about the Music Business Registry. The Music Business Registry is the leading music industry publisher of the most up-to-date contact information for major and independent record label A&R, music publishers, artist managers, music attorneys, music supervisors, and much, much more. The Music Business Registry is the trusted industry standard and source serving the music business community for over 28 years with the most accurate and up-to-date contact information available. Their titles include the A&R Registry, the Film and Television Music Monthly, the Music Publisher Registry, and the Music Attorney Registry. All of their publications are available in print, PDF, CSV, or online subscription. Visit them now at musicregistry.com and receive a 10% discount by using coupon code MUBUTV10 at checkout. That's musicregistry.com, coupon code MUBUTV10. When you're ready to put your music to work, musicregistry.com.
What do Motley Crue, June Carter Cash, and Guns N' Roses all have in common? They all were managed at one time by our featured guest this week, Vicky Hamilton. Vicky has been a friend of mine for, over 30 years. I have known her. I remember meeting her when she was at Geffen, and she was an A&R executive there. We talked about her career as a manager, as an A&R executive, as a woman coming out from the Midwest, the challenges that she had, meeting the bands, all of that. It was such an interesting conversation with her about that particular period of time, and it was a very, very, very fertile time in the area of music, especially in LA. That
Absolutely.
Particular period in Los Angeles was a very, very healthy time and a very healthy scene, very, very healthy club scene. So we got into her work as a manager, as an A&R executive, her experiences at Geffen. We talked about her, then going on to doing A&R at Capitol. And, and we also got into some very personal things too. It's a very interesting interview. And she talked about, that very dark period after Capitol Records and, what she was going through in her life. And, it very, very, very insightful, interesting conversation with someone who not only was there, but was on the front lines with some of the most seminal artists of that
time.
Era.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And was it became the impetus for her book, Appetite for Dysfunction. So, a lot of the points that I thought were really interesting was, her dealing with these bands, which back then, pre-Me Too movement, was how she was dealing with these bands and artists being a woman in that world where, that was the world that was really very misogynistic against women. And so, very interesting insight from her about that. And then, of course, the story of meeting Guns N' Roses and her introducing, Axl and Slash, working with June Carter Cash and the great pleasure that she took in developing that, which led to a Grammy. And, just very interesting conversation.
Absolutely. It really was. Vicky, this is a great story. And for those of you that, want to understand, what it is to be a manager, what it is to work with bands from the ground up, what it is to be in the music business, to come out here from the Midwest and start with nothing and to really build an incredible name for yourself, you definitely want to listen to this.
With that, insiders, sit back, relax, and enjoy our feature conversation with Vicky Hamilton.
Vicky, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
When did you decide in your life, or do you remember when you decided that music was going to be your career?
I do remember I was working at B.F. Goodrich, trimming the tits off of tires, and a guy that I was working beside of got pulled into the bend when he took his blades around heavy duty tire and got really hurt. And I was like, this is not going to be my life. So that was when I made the conscious decision then, like coming out of art school and, dealing with some teachers that did not see my idea of what art should be,
Interesting. Okay. And, was that something that you felt artistically? I mean, that they just you didn't see eye to eye with them, or was it a philosophical difference, or talk about that?
Well, the art school was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I'm kind of a surrealist, lowbrow painter, and I had done a landscape in reds and purple, and the teacher said to me, he gave me a C on the project, and I was like, why? And he's like, because those aren't realistic colors. And I was like, well, they might be if you were on Mars, It's like, I kind of liked Andy Warhol and those type of people, as a kid. So
you were drawn,
I don't know.
Yeah, you were drawn more to you had a broader view of what artistic sensibilities were.
Absolutely. And even in my adult life, I worked with Ron English and Maxine Miller and Eric Montoya and, Anthony Oskang. They're all like great surrealist painters. It's just my personal taste of what I like.
Vicky, this is Eric. Thank you so much for doing this. Did you work in the music business before moving to Los Angeles?
Well, sort of. I was a record store clerk in a record store, and I was a record buyer, and I did some journalism for Free Press, and I worked for a company called Sounds in the City, where I booked these concerts in Fort Wayne, Indiana, like these outdoor park type sort of scenarios. But that was basically all I had under my belt at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you were pretty much doing stuff music related, so that would be pre-music business LA.
I mean, I took it to the ceiling of music in Indiana, pretty much. There was just like nowhere else to go, so I had to move. And I met Tom Petty, and he told me I looked like a California girl, and that was kind of like all she wrote. I was like ready to move.
Really? So that's what inspired you to go to California rather than New York or Nashville?
Well, I had always thought starve in the sunshine instead of starve in the snow. I thought I was going to marry Tom Petty, so it definitely had a hand in making the decision for me. And I had never been to California, so at that point in time, I had one friend that was a nurse in Marina del Rey, and I came out and visited her for a month, and then I went back and saved money for a year and moved, basically.
Let me ask you, and this is sort of a broad question that you can sort of dive deep into. When you moved out here, what was the music scene like when you arrived here in the early 80s?
Oh, it was awesome. It was on the tail end of punk rock and going into sort of a English invasion as well as an indie invasion, and just on the very beginning of the metal scene.
Right.
I got a job at Licorice Pizza on the Sunset Strip, across the street from the Whiskey A Go-Go. And
right up the street from Tower Records, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But, if location is everything, Licorice Pizza had it in spades for that. It's like you could see the whole strip from the window there.
Yes.
And, I remember watching punk rockers get arrested and having their wrists zip tied together and loaded into the paddy wagon, and the cops were like setting them out on the curb, and one of the guys like running through the crowd of people with his mohawk sort of blowing in the wind. I was like, yeah, that's really punk rock. But it was a different time. I mean, you could like promote freely on the strip, and kids were like putting their posters on the telephone poles, and there'd be flyers like an inch or two deep, and every band had their own flyer, and they were like hustling like carnival barkers on the street, and it was just very exciting. I'd never seen anything like that coming from Indiana.
When you got here, who were some of the acts that you remember that were making names for themselves on the Strip at that time that you were seeing?
The first concert I went to was Joan Jett at the Whiskey, but she had already had a hit and was happening. And Duran Duran was just coming up. They played the Roxy. I remember seeing Television at the Whiskey, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Quiet Riot were just starting to get a name. Tom Petty was huge, but he was already big at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Like
by
the
that
Plimsouls.
Yeah. Okay.
Plimsouls, X, and then, of course, Motley Crue, which was the first band that I worked with.
Okay.
In LA. Yeah.
Yeah, let me ask you, Vicky, what were you doing at that time to make a living when you arrived in LA?
Anything I could, pretty much. I did 3 cocktailing jobs. My first one was at the Palomino, and I was hired and fired by Tommy Thomas. And I'm not a very good waitress, I got to admit. But then I went on to cocktail at Gazzari's and the Starwood.
Okay. I remember the Starwood. I lived in the next block from the Starwood. There it was on Crescent Heights, and I lived on Laurel Avenue. I remember the Starwood very, very well.
Yeah, I lived, oh God, what's the name? Was it Laurel? What's the one that's one over from Crescent Heights?
Which direction?
Towards the beach.
Oh, God, I don't. Is it Ogden? Is it
no
Sweetser?
No,
I don't remember the name.
It was like right across the street from where the Starwood was, and I lived with a guy that had been a roadie for Led Zeppelin, and he had skin cats on the wall, and it was like my first resident in LA. He really scared me.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd never met anyone like that either. That didn't last very long.
I want to touch on something here. In your book, in your marvelous book, Appetite for Dysfunction, you reveal how you met and worked with and managed so many bands early on. Motley Crue, Poison, Faster Pussycat, and of course Guns N' Roses. And I guess my question to you is, did you always have a natural instinct for great talent? Because you seem to be drawn, to a lot of acts that were really, really, the cream of the crop of their genre of music.
Well, first of all, I want to say I was a management consultant for Motley Crue and Stryper. I didn't actually manage them. But, I think because I came from the Midwest, I had very commercial taste, because in the Midwest, they only play commercial radio. So
right. Especially then. And AOR was powerful then, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I learned from that experience that, there has to be really hooky choruses. And I mean, there were a bevy of those metal bands, glam bands, whatever. But, unless they had like good hooks, I wasn't interested,
Okay, so it was the songs that initially always attracted you then?
Well, the songs, the look, the feel of things. Like, I remember when I first started working as a management consultant to Motley Crue, I had gone back to Indiana, and I had their promo records that I was, passing out. And a lot of my friends in Indiana were like, oh man, this is never going to happen, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you wait, this is going to happen huge,
What inspired your faith in them?
Fast forward a year or two.
Yeah.
They just had something different. It was kind of the combination of punk rock and glam rock and English invasion. I mean, all the things that were sort of happening. And I mean, I just felt like Nikki Sixx was a genius, and I still think that he is. I mean, he's just always ahead of the curve of things.
Definitely, yeah, for sure. Definitely a trailblazer. You've always had a great track record with all of the bands that you've worked with, and they trusted you. I wonder, was being a woman in the rock and roll business then a difficult obstacle for you? And I'm asking from the perspective of living in the Me Too movement of today.
Well, honestly, I just think that women are more nurturing in general and complimentary towards the arts. I think today it's a little tougher because men and women don't really know how to be around each other anymore. It's like, you can't even kid around about it, which I kind of miss.
Right.
I always tried to be one of the boys, and today it's like I can't really do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard now, even for men and women, because there's such a concern now. Is it going to be taken the wrong way? Am I going to be, so I can't imagine that. That's why we asked that question, because I mean, coming, a woman coming from the Midwest, or a young,
Well, plus the street goes both ways.
Yeah.
It's like I don't want to be sued for sexual harassment because I like to kid, but unless I know someone really well, I will not kid with them now,
Of course, yeah. Yeah, it's just curious, because from that time, it's such a different time. So I can imagine, the mentality with men back then, especially in that music scene, and, all the excess and everything. Just be curious what how you went through that process, how you survived it. I guess you were kind of like what you said, just one of the guys.
It was the best way, And I'm a lot different person now than I was in the 80s. I mean, I was a wake and bake pot smoker back then. And, I could drink Jack Daniels as well as the next guy. But, I've been completely clean and sober for almost 19 years now. So it's a different time.
So, well, let me ask you then, on that note, did that quality or that aspect of your personality, did that help engender friendships and help bond you to a lot of the acts, or was that not a factor?
I think it did in some instances. Certainly the people that smoke pot, I mean, I won't go into who they were, but,
right.
We were always trying to outdo each other with who had the better pot, In
talking about this in that time, you were around that scene for so many years, and I'm just curious in terms of, your memory, was there any sense of camaraderie among all the bands that were back in that scene then, or was it more competitive?
I mean, there was a degree of camaraderie. Like Axl introduced me to Faster Pussycat, who I managed, mostly because he wanted them to open for them at the Whiskey instead of the Unforgiven. And but I find that bands, they tell you about a band, they're usually really good, because bands hate everything. So if a band actually says somebody's good, they usually are, It's never been in LA like it is in Nashville, where there is that camaraderie and everybody co-writes and does all that. It's never been like that here. It's always been a bit more competitive.
Right. I just meant from a friendship point of view, or in terms of knowing each other. But, it's interesting what you're saying about the aspect of, bands turning you on to, telling you about other acts, like Axl with Faster Pussycat. Were the bands that you were involved with, were any of them instrumental in turning you on to bands that you weren't aware of?
I'm sure it happened, other than Faster Pussycat. I'm trying to think. Off the top of my head, I can't really come up with any more, but I'm sure it happened, especially when I was doing A&R at Geffen and Capitol. Yeah.
How did you end up meeting Guns N' Roses? Tell us the story of how that all began.
I was a booking agent at a place called Silver Lining Entertainment. And Axl called me on the phone and he said, you come highly recommended. We want you to book us some shows. And I was like, okay, cool. Send me a demo. He's like, well, can I just come in and play you some music? I was like, well, I don't have a stereo here. And he's like, it's okay. I'll bring in my ghetto blaster. And that made me laugh. I was like, yeah, okay, well, come on in then, and a few hours later, he and Izzy showed up with a ghetto blaster in hand and a few photographs. And, it was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. That's, I booked them sight unseen, opening for Black Sheep and Striper. And
what was it about them? I mean, when they showed up and with the ghetto blaster, what was it about them that was so exciting and different and unique to you at that time? What was it?
It just sounded more dangerous than the girly sort of glam rock thing that was happening in that moment in time. And I don't know, Axl just had this unbelievable voice, and the songs really resonated with me. They felt sort of dangerous and how I felt about this city. And I don't know, it passed my goosebump test. Let's just say that. When when the hairs stand up on your arm and you get goosebumps, you just know, or at least that's how I know,
Yeah, that's funny. We just ended up
good.
talking to Mike Klink just recently in our previous interview, and he said the same thing, that the hairs were standing up on his arms when he was listening to the playback of that record. He just knew.
Yeah, I mean, if you flash back to that time period, it was like the other bands on the scene, like Poison and Warrant and I don't know, Pretty Boy Floyd. It just seemed, I don't know, it just felt really more powerful.
Felt
and
more real.
Serious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So upon meeting them, you knew right away that they were the real thing, didn't you?
I did. I mean, I met them when they were Hollywood Rose. It was not Guns N' Roses yet. It's like Slash at that point in time was in Black Sheep with Willie Bass, who I booked. And when I booked them at the Music Machine, I watched Slash and Axl shake hands, and it was like one of those slow-mo moments where it just sort of happened in slow motion. I mean, I thought that I introduced them, but Slash later said that he had jammed with Axl at another time, but I definitely put them back together. So
wow, and that's when they opened for Slash's band.
Yeah, it was kind of their first gig for me, so that I could see if they could really play.
Sure. Yeah, you wanted to see if they could deliver on what you were delivering. Absolutely.
Yeah.
How long did it take for you to get them signed? Number one, and was it a competitive signing? Were there other labels also interested at that time?
Well, it was like a year period of Hollywood Rose, which had Chris Webber as the guitar player, and then Guns N' Roses coming together. There were I missed that whole Tracy Guns era of the band. It's like I never worked with Tracy, but once they had put Slash in the band, and Slash is my boy. I loved him then. I love him now. I don't think there will ever be a time I don't love him, So when Slash was confirmed in the band, that's when I wanted to manage the band. And when Slash and Steven ended up in the band, it wasn't long after that people started being interested in it. And they made that 5-song demo, and I started shopping it. I'd say, maybe 4 months. It was it got worked up into a signing frenzy. We pretty much had dinner and lunch with every label in town, and everybody wanted it.
Everybody wanted it. Okay, so talk to me about what that A&R, I guess, headspace or that A&R experience was like at that time where everybody wanted it. I mean, you ultimately went with Geffen, and we'll get into that, but what was that experience like? What you met with everybody, you had dinner with everybody. Why did you choose Geffen? What was it about them over all those other labels?
Well, I had always felt that Geffen was the place, but it wasn't ultimately my decision.
Right.
I mean, the band, I wanted to wind it up a bit more to get more money for them. And we had a show booked at the Roxy that I booked 2 Guns N' Roses shows in one night, and they actually signed the deal with Geffen the day before the showcase because, Axl basically said, we're going with Geffen. I mean, Tom Zutaut was very smart. He had them up to his house and wined and dined them and played Aerosmith records with them all night. And then the next day they were like, we're signing with Geffen. So I didn't have much say.
Okay, so he was the conduit, but were other labels at that time, you wanted to wind it up, but were other labels at that time just as interested, you said? There was a frenzy. So
oh, yeah.
What were some of the other experiences for you at that time?
Well, there was that historical meeting with Susan Collins and Ron Fair at Chrysalis where Axl told Susan if she ran down the street naked, he would sign there,
Oh, God.
and I think for a moment she actually considered it, but had no right to climb.
I could just see it now where, Susan saying, Vicky, I just couldn't bring myself to doing it. I just couldn't. I
felt really bad for her because she really, really wanted it. And I mean, she took all of us to the Ivy for dinner. And I'm sure the bill, even in 1985, was over $1,000. It's like they had so much booze and, the most expensive thing on the menu. And then she came down when they played at Fender's Ballroom with Johnny Thunders. And I remember standing on the soundboard, watching the crowd, and Fender's stage was just like a couple of inches, from the floor. It wasn't like very high off the floor. And I saw Susan down there for 1 second, and then I didn't see her anymore. So I got scared because they were like slam dancing and all that stuff. I went and jumped in the crowd and grabbed her by the back of her jacket and pulled her out because she's so small. I was afraid she was going to get hurt.
Right. Right. Exactly. So did you ever have a discussion with the band as to, they met with everybody. They met with Susan. They met with Ron. They met with, the other labels. They met with, what was it about Tom Zutaut or about Geffen that sealed the deal for them that the others didn't have?
I think Geffen was just a superior label. I mean, and they were a very rock heavy label then. And, let's face it, Slash loved Aerosmith, and Aerosmith were there. And, we had Whitesnake. They had all kinds of rock bands. So it felt right. And, Tom promised them the moon, like our first meeting was with Peter Philbin, and, Axl was like, do you want to sign the band? And he's like, well, I think you guys are really good, but nothing's ever instant iced tea with me. And, I need to consider, different elements and stuff. And Axl said, well, don't wait too long because, we won't be available. And I think he liked that Tom was instantly ready to go, He
liked that Tom knew and was passionate in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Let me ask you, Vicky, why didn't you continue to manage Guns N' Roses?
Well, Axl took me to the Rainbow one night and said that he didn't know if I would be the manager forever because, I think there were certain boys club players that were putting in his head that I couldn't manage the band as good as a male manager. And I said, well, let me talk to Doug Thaler, who was then working with Doc McGee, and see if I can co-manage the band with them. And, we had this meeting, and Axl said, okay, yeah, well, if you can do that, then maybe, that would work. So I took them all down to McGee Entertainment. We're sitting around the conference table, and certain members were nodding off at the table. And Doug Thaler, after the meeting, pulled me outside, and he's like, Vicky, we love this band. We love you. But we have Motley Crue here. We don't want another one of these bands. So that didn't work out. And then Tom Zutaut was saying to me he could get me an A&R job if I, would help him sign the band to Geffen. And, after Motley Crue and Stryper and Poison, I was kind of ready for a steady paycheck. So I took an A&R job at Geffen.
Yeah, you ended up being an A&R executive at Geffen. And, I'm just wondering, that was your first experience working at a label. And I'm curious, what did that experience teach you? What did you learn from working at a label like Geffen from the inside?
Well, in the very beginning, it was educational in that there are so many different departments at a record company. There's like the legal department, the press department, the marketing department, international, publishing. I didn't realize that everybody had their own job to do, So it was very valuable in that regard. And, I worked under David Geffen, so you don't get, it's not the same business anymore. And I don't know if there's really the David Geffens out there anymore. I mean, I suppose there are to some degree, maybe a Scooter Braun or whoever, but, David pretty much trusted Tom Zutaut and Gary Gersh and John Kolodner to make their own decisions. And he called them his three geniuses and pretty much let them do what they wanted to do. I mean, obviously he had to sign off when they wanted to spend a lot of money, but he trusted their judgment. And that was really smart.
After Geffen, you went to work at Capitol. How was it working at a label the size of Capitol after Geffen?
Actually, I went from Geffen to Lookout Management, and I helped them start up Vapor Records. And Gary Gersh then became the president of Capitol Records. And I really wanted to work with Gary. I love Gary Gersh. I still do. I mean, he's at AEG now doing international, but I like his taste in bands, and I just think that he's really a great guy. Capitol, I was more of a independent street scout. I didn't have an office there. I just went in for the A&R meetings, and he allowed me to manage and do things that I wanted to do away from there. So it was very appealing. I had the security of a paycheck, but also the independence to be a manager.
Now, Vicky, you obviously met Gary, I guess, was it before you worked at Geffen or while you were at Geffen?
Actually, Gary Gersh hired me to Licorice Pizza when I was, first in LA.
Okay.
I never got to work with him at Licorice Pizza because he went to work at the corporate head office after he hired me. But I met him then, and then I worked with him at Geffen Records and then again at Capitol Records.
Hey, Insiders, we hope that you've been enjoying our featured interview. Stay tuned because we've got so much more value coming your way. But before we dive back in, a word from our sponsor. Hey, Rich, you're the founder, CEO, legend of Music Business Registry. Tell us what the Music Business Registry is all about.
Well, what it's about, Eric, is it's a company that is designed to provide the most accurate and up-to-date contact information for the music business. So if someone is looking to reach the A&R community, if someone is looking to reach music publishers, if someone needs to reach artist managers, if someone needs to reach music attorneys, if someone's looking to place their music into film and television and needs to reach all the music supervisors, that's the contact information that we provide. We've been doing it for 28 years. We're sort of the industry standard, if you will, for the music business and have been serving them since 1992. So that's what we do.
Amazing. So if I wanted to find out, let's say A&R people from Warner Brothers, let's say, I can just go in there and find that in the A&R registry?
Absolutely. You'll find all of the Warner Brothers in there. You'll find the Warner Brothers in LA, Warner Brothers in New York, Warner Brothers in Nashville, Warner Brothers in London, Warner Brothers, probably in Australia as well. So those are the main territories that we cover.
Amazing. And we're offering all of our insiders right now that are listening, if you visit musicregistry.com and use coupon code MUBUTV10 at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount off your first order. That's musicregistry.com, coupon code MUBUTV10. Anything else you want to say, Rich?
Well, when you're ready to put your music to work, musicregistry.com. What was it about Gary that made him so special, especially when you got to work with him at Geffen? That was in a totally different capacity than retail. That was, he was in A&R and you were in A&R. So what was it about him that you liked? I mean, you mentioned his taste and how you had similar sensibilities. What else was special about Gary?
I just think he's a born leader. He knows how to run companies, and he has an elegance that most A&R people don't have.
Interesting. Okay. So he's got an elegance. In addition, we should also say for our audience that, Gary Gersh is the man who ended up, a couple years later signing Nirvana to Geffen, as well, as many other artists. He signed David Bowie to EMI, to the EMI deal after RCA. And, you're right. He loves to have that direct relationship with the artist. And I think artists like him because he is more elegant and sophisticated than most. That's very, very true about him.
Yeah, absolutely. And he has good taste in music,
Yeah, exactly. So. Yeah, he does have very, very good taste in music. And it is interesting. He's in AEG now, working in the live business.
Yeah, he does. He's the head of AEG International.
Right. I want to go back to your particular journey. In Appetite for Dysfunction, you wrote about that very dark period after you left Capitol. And I guess on a personal level, what did that time teach you about yourself?
Well, it wasn't like I left Capitol. They got rid of Gary Gersh and let the whole regime go, basically. So I found myself jobless, and I had made that record with June Carter Cash on my own. When I was at Lookout, I picked that up, and then it won a Grammy. And all of a sudden, I find myself without a job, without any money, and sort of fending for myself. And at the same time, June Carter Cash had planted in my mind that maybe I should get sober. So I was pondering all that, and my mother died. All these things happened at the same time. So I decided that I had to get sober and did. I cried every month or every day for 6 months. I took a dog walking job and, it was dark, but I learned about my warrior spirit during that time period, that I'm a survivor and I get through everything. It made me stronger, I think.
Yeah, I guess, the other thing that I see in knowing you is that it also made you realize that you not only are a survivor, but that you're an independent entrepreneur and you could go out on your own.
Yeah, after Geffen Records, I never put all my eggs in one basket ever again. And I'm going through another scenario right now where somebody wants to sign me to shop my screenplay /TV series. And I have a problem with doing exclusive deals because I don't like being tied down,
Right. No, I totally get that.
What inspired you to write Appetite for Dysfunction?
I always knew that I wanted to write it. In fact, when I did my deal with Geffen Records, there was a clause in there that said that they had the rights to my life story. And I made my lawyer change that because I had it in my mind that I was going to write this book. And thankfully I did. Yeah. I had the foresight to get that removed. But I've always been sort of a writer. I co-wrote songs with Greg Darling from Darling Cruel. And when I managed him, I got a publishing deal as a songwriter. And I've always written poetry and things. And I was a journalist. I even did some writing for you, Rich, remember?
I do remember
for
it
the
very
A&R
well.
registry.
Yes.
I did A&R profiling, which was great because that taught me a lot about the individual A&R people. I love that. I like profiling things. But I worked on the book for 7 years. It wasn't like something that I did every day. I made a list of what the chapters were going to be, and then whatever I felt like working on that day, I would chip away at it, And I had a lot of help too. I had 3 editors, one who was Peter Margolis, he's a film guy now, but he was in a band called Stainless Steel back then. He was a great editor for me, and Catherine Truman, who's a, journalist, and Denny Anderson, who helped me typeset the book. So, it's a much stronger book because I had 3 editors, and it took me over a year to edit it. I had copywritten the book before an edit, so it took a long time, but I'm glad I took the time to do that.
So they were helpful in shaping it.
Yeah. It still sounds like my voice, but I think when you're writing, especially a memoir, that you need to bounce it off of some people to find out what's interesting to them. It's my life, so I don't know what's interesting to someone else,
Sure. And your
so
experiences and your own sense of history and looking back on a period that, was culturally significant.
But I also wrote about a lot of the bands that didn't make it because I think it's important to know that not everybody makes it, and people react to things in different ways.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the themes that runs through that is, people's hopes and dreams, throughout the book, not only yours and the desires that you had about and the feelings about art, but among the many bands, we the longer you're in this business, I think the more you see that. And, you do talk about that in the book. You don't only talk about the big visible, acts like Motley Crue or Guns N' Roses, but you talk about others who, did it for the love and for whatever reason, didn't have the massive success. So that's definitely a theme that, I remember coming through in the book a lot.
Well, I think that people that don't live in LA or any major town like New York or London or whatever, they only have a very nighttime view of what the industry is, and it's all glamorous and what have you. The music industry is not glamorous. Ever.
Yeah. No,
I don't think.
I know what you mean. I teach at Musicians Institute, and, I deal with students all the time who have an image of what the music industry is based on either, fantasy or images or just what they think. But there's nothing real about it. It's like, it's kind of like event memory. Like, if your memory was just, you were taken to the Grammy Awards and that was the night and you met people, that's what you would think the music industry was if you had no experience. It's like, what are you doing for the other 6 days this week? It's
and also it's all about the overnight success of it's like,
right.
There is no overnight success. I mean, I guess pop artists have a little shorter of a run, but nobody I worked with made it in like over, they at least were out there a year before they started having some success. And to me, it's like the struggling period is the most interesting period, because everybody knows what happens afterwards, but they don't know how the steps they took to get there,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. I think that, it's the journey. The
stories,
and the stories that are the most interesting part. Absolutely.
And it's like when people win their Grammy Award or their Academy Award, when they cry, I understand why they cry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lady Gaga.
Never thinking to actually get there.
Yeah, Lady Gaga had a really great speech, I think, during the Academy Awards this past year where, she really just, started crying and just, telling the story about what it took for me to get to this point, And
she's had a 10-year run of big successes, but, it's not all, the career isn't always going straight uphill. There's a lot of, ebbs and flows, as in any career. I mean, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, I mean, these are all perfect examples of after the big success, how rocky and tumultuous and difficult certain circumstances were that have nothing to do with success. In fact, maybe success exacerbates their downfall more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 61 years old and I still struggle. So it's like, it's a struggle,
No, I know exactly what you mean. Let me ask you, let me just switch gears here and ask you a kind of an experienced business question. In today's business, what do you feel is the best route for someone who's genuinely interested in becoming an artist manager?
I'd say learn by doing. It's like, it's great if you go to MI or to some college and get a degree, but you're going to learn far more by actually putting your ass on the line and trying to make a band happen,
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like the school of experience. I mean, you can learn, the basics at the school. You can learn, how contracts work and all of that. But then you have to go out and you have to apply it. You have to apply it in the real world and, make sure that you're always educating yourself and always keeping up, like you're saying, just having the experience of doing it. What has been the experience that you've had in management that's been probably the most satisfying for you personally?
I don't know. It's hard to say. But what I can say is making that record with June Carter Cash. It wasn't a management experience per se, but most of the bands I worked with were baby bands when I picked them up. And June Carter was already a legend. And, she was married to Johnny Cash, who was a legend, and being able to take that and turn that into a Grammy and hire the producers and pick the songs with her and make a Grammy award-winning record, that was super gratifying for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did it out of the love. There was no, I remember in the book, you talk about that experience very specifically where you say, you couldn't get anyone else to, support, or no other labels wanted to put the record out, but you believed in it and you put your own time, energy, sweat, and life on the line to do that. And that's what I think, made it so gratifying.
And then after the record was made and before came out, there was this big buzz about it, and Johnny Cash invited me down to the Four Seasons where they always stayed when they came into town. And I had sent a record to him to their place in Jamaica, and he pulled it out of his pocket and he's like, everybody wants to take credit for this, but I know you did this. That was better than, a Grammy in my mind.
Right, being told by Johnny Cash that he knows in his heart you are the one responsible for his wife's record. Yeah.
Sure, because in his own book, he said, if I had one wish, it would be for June to have more success. And I was able to help him deliver that, you know?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful quality. Absolutely.
Are there any books for our audience out there, besides your own wonderful Appetite for Dysfunction, that you would recommend to up-and-coming managers, artists, and other entrepreneurs? Any books, any kind of, movies, anything that you can suggest out there?
Oh, gosh, there's so many great books. I read a lot of autobiographies. I think, there's little nuggets in all of those. I mean, one of my favorite book is Patti Smith's Just Kids. I've read that like 3 or 4 times, and I modeled my own book after it, made it the same size and all.
Really?
I love that book. I mean, I think you have to watch Swimming with Sharks if you want to work in the entertainment business, because that, although is a comedy, is kind of on the mark, as well as This is Spinal Tap.
Oh. Oh, yeah. I mean, when I saw Spinal Tap, I thought, if you're in the music business, you will appreciate this movie much more than if you're not in the music business.
I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
It holds up even today,
Oh, I completely agree. And I remember, what was it, 1982 that movie came out? Something like that?
I'm not exactly
yeah.
sure, but...
But I remember thinking that. I remember thinking, God, this is so hysterical. I mean, I remember that publicist in the movie, and I thought, I knew publicists like that. The woman who was,
right.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, they really nailed it. And, it's like, I guess there's a depth of appreciation that somebody who works in the music industry would have for that film that a layman or a laywoman could not have.
Right.
Yeah. Very much so. Vicky, you've worked with so many different types of acts over the years. You also not only work in music, but you've also managed photographers as well. Talk about that for a little bit.
Not really photographers. I mean, I've worked with Baz here and Robert John, but I have worked with many painters, and I love that. I mean, I came from art school, so my theory in art is don't sign anybody that can't paint better than you. And, I find that art and music sort of run in the same circle, as does fashion. I mean, I've never done anything really in fashion, but fashion kind of dictates music, as does art. So it's like I look at all of those things culturally to sort of figure out what's going on in the world,
Yeah.
Politics as well. I mean, I think we're headed for a big revolution. So, I think rock's going to make a huge comeback, or at least that's what I'm banking on for my own record company. I want somebody like Bob Dylan or, that has a message, because we need it right now.
No, boy, do we ever. I mean, we need, it's funny. I mean, this is a subject that I, felt very, very strong about in the 80s. I mean, I remember coming out of the 60s and 70s where we had artists who truly had something to say, where we had artists who were innovative and they made statements. And in the 80s, that whole sense, and I guess it's, it's like you were saying, the politics, the times, the culture, that all went away. Something else became more popular, and very, very few artists really had, something to say about the times and the world that we lived in. And I have often wondered, especially, and that was 30 something years ago, but now in today, when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, yeah, I totally hear you, because I wonder, where are the artists who are popular today, who truly have something to say, who truly are willing to put their feelings out there without, there's so much fear around doing that. Like, God forbid you should alienate your fans, or God forbid you should alienate some corporation or whatever. It just seems like, I don't know if it's that they're not there from a consciousness point of view, or if it's just they're not there because they are fearful of the blowback and consequences.
I think that's probably true, but there are a lot of people out there that are speaking their truth as well. I see it in the young bands a lot. Like I work with a singer-songwriter named Damian Sage, and he's very conscious about what's going on in the world, and I love his songwriting. And then I just picked up this band called Lovely World from South Carolina, and the singer sent me lyrics that were about the heroin crisis. And I read the lyrics and I called him up. I go, wow, this is like really brilliant, but should I be worried? And he's like, no, so many of my friends are into opiates, and I just wanted to talk about, my feelings about it. And I think that's like really important. It's like this opiate crisis is out of control, when they're like, in New York City, and I think it was in Pennsylvania, I saw it on 60 Minutes, that they're bringing in ice trucks to like accommodate all the dead bodies because they don't have room in the morgue. I mean, something's got to happen,
I mean, in 1 year alone, in 2016, more people died of opioid addiction and opioid deaths than died in Vietnam. I mean, that's a fact, and it didn't stop at 2015 or 2016. Over 212,000 people is the latest report have died in the last like 3 or 4 years. I mean, it is a real crisis.
Well, I think there's a desperation out there that we've like never seen before. And, I don't know where you guys are about Trump, but the man's like a liar. And it's like, I don't know. It makes me ashamed to be an American. It's like we are all one person, we bleed the same color. It doesn't matter what color our skin is or our sexual orientation, or, we should be trying to figure out how to, coexist in this world and make it a better planet for the people that are going to be here after us,
Yeah, exactly. And that's not something I've ever felt, about Trump at all. I feel he's much more, divisive than he is a unifier. So, yeah, definitely. Vicky, what advice do you have for artists today? I mean, you must meet a lot of, talent. You must deal with a lot of talent. What advice do you have for up-and-coming artists today who are wanting to seek careers as professional musicians in the music business?
Number one, it's all about the songs. So write as many songs as you can and, go back and revisit them and make them better, And number two is be true to thy own self. It's like there's a lot of people in the industry who will try to tell you who to be in the world. But if you're true to your own self, the time will eventually come around to you. And I guess the third thing would be trust your gut. Because if you're sensing something, that's like your internal clock telling you what's really going on.
Absolutely. Where can people find you, Vicky, if they want to get a hold of you? Can you share any website?
Sure. I'm starting a record company called Dark Spark Music, and that website is up, and you can write to me on that. And I also have VickyHamilton.com. I'm kind of folding in the aesthetic V because nobody can spell it, and marketing geniuses are telling me that I should change everything to Dark Spark Music. And let's face it, if you can't spell Dark Spark Music, I don't want to work with you anyway. So, yeah, I'm out there. I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay. All right. What things are exciting you today, musically?
Musically? Well, I'm a rock girl at heart. So I still like rock. I don't really like heavy metal anymore. I'm not angry like I used to be. So angry stuff doesn't really appeal to me. I like singer-songwriters in like the purest form too. I like to hear it in like the bare bones and then like contemplate, who's the right producer for this, who would like really make a great record, So that excites me. And then, with the book, I'm getting a lot of film and TV interest, and I'm very excited about that and can't wait to see where it ends up and what it ends up being. I'm trying to be open-minded because I, had this whole set idea that it should be a fictionalized television show. But if it turns out to be a feature film about my life or even like a realistic sort of, I don't know what, miniseries or whatever, I'm open-minded,
Are you getting a lot of interest in various arenas as a film, as a TV show, as a fictional, as a...
It's like every production company I meet with has a different idea. And it's like I try not to shoot things down. want to walk away and think about it, It is my life, so I'm a little precious about that. So how I'm represented and all that. But it's going to be fun. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to the next chapter. That would be great. Vicky, I can't thank you enough. We both do very, very much. Thank you for joining us and for doing this today.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky.
Thank you. Wow. What a great piece of history. I mean, there's like some, that was a conversation that was, takes us back, what, 35 years. 35 years. And, not only to a different era, but to a different industry.
Right.
A different time and a different industry, different values. The industry was different. The landscape and the cultural landscape was different. Not only the musical aspects of what she was dealing with were different too. And it seems like, as far as popular culture went, there was a far greater diversity. We had all the rock, but we also had pop, and we had R&B. We had different distinctions.
Probably
then.
The last time of that type of diversity.
Yeah.
The last times, leaning into the 90s, there was more diversity, but yeah, that was kind of like the beginning of the end of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I think that whole element around 2000, 2001, 2, 3, that all started to homogenize.
Right.
It's when we, started to see that pop music or dance music or whatever really took a far, far more dominant, started to be far more dominant in the music culture. But then again, we can look at the technologies that allowed that to occur.
Right. And I thought it was interesting, her with the whole idea of being a woman in rock back then, not in the Me Too era, which has vastly changed.
Absolutely, especially back then when the mores of the times, the attitudes were very different. And I thought what was interesting about what she said was that, she always wanted to be like one of the guys.
Right, exactly.
And that, that she liked to kid around and so forth. But there was a different kind of attitude back then. It was, it's very much like, you remember when we asked Michael Alago about, did he ever get harassed for being a gay man in a very,
male dominant driven world.
Yeah,
very
testosterone, very machismo.
Right.
Yeah, and the few experiences he had, he put them in their place.
Right.
And Vicky was right in the heart of that. I mean, remember, it wasn't only Guns N' Roses, as she mentioned. it was also Poison. It was Motley Crue. It was it was that whole scene that she was involved with and deeply immersed in that kind of conscious.
I thought the other point that I thought was good about that was that she talked about how women are more nurturing, which I totally 100% agree.
Absolutely.
Being that I work with a lot of women, with the management company and that kind of thing. And so I can, it was very interesting that she brought that point out, because I definitely agree.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that that's an extremely important thing to talk about, because that's one of the key components, I think, that makes for a great manager. You have to be nurturing.
Nurturing, exactly.
Your job is to nurture the talent. And along those same lines, Eric, when she spoke about that, today men and women don't know how to be around each other.
Right.
And I thought that was a really astute point. I mean, that
you have to be careful.
Yeah. Not only careful, but that there's like this almost like lack of how to even do it.
Exactly.
Even if you're careful, it's like we don't seem to have that kind of understanding anymore. And she even said, she says, I don't want to be
sued or
harassed, and that's very real. It sounds like maybe it's far-fetched. It's not.
It's not.
All we have to do is say Katy Perry, who, has gone through that with people who were models on her video shoots, contestants on the show. There's been a lot for precisely this very reason.
Right.
She harassed me. She sexually came on to me. She, grabbed me. She, all of this thing. And this is something that, if women aren't careful, they get accused of the same thing.
Exactly.
So it's the same kind of principle.
Yeah, one of the other things that I thought was great about the interview was also, did she know that Guns N' Roses was the real thing?
Oh, yeah.
She met them, pre Guns N' Roses when they were still known as Hollywood Roses. And I just thought that section of the interview was really great, especially with the whole idea that she reintroduced, I guess, Slash and Axl.
Yeah.
And seeing that going into slow motion, even though I guess Slash had told her that they had met
once
previously.
Before, right.
but she was kind of like, taking that, I was responsible for bringing them back together, but she just said that it was just like, magical.
Exactly. That kind of chemistry that, comes together.
And I think also believing, like, also checking to see if, they could actually deliver live, which was a big thing. Obviously, you get this perception of a band that, my God, these guys sound great on tape, but how are they going to deliver live?
That's crucial, because in the world you're talking about, it wouldn't have mattered how brilliant their records were if they couldn't deliver live.
Exactly.
That whole culture, you must deliver live in order to have legitimacy.
Particularly in rock.
Particularly, I mean, especially in rock, you don't have a career, and we're talking 35 years ago. I think that to a great extent, that principle, although it may be slightly different, that principle is still very, very active today, regardless of genre.
Right.
If you don't have that ability, and notwithstanding COVID, but if you don't have that ability to deliver live, you don't have much of a career. And the reason you don't have much of a career is because a lot of the elements that make up a career today have to have that component of, artist and audience connection in order to happen, whether it's merch or the live performance.
I would
or
say it's like
sponsorships.
music always first, that we talk about the songs, that we harp on the show, and just everywhere we're talking about it, that it's the songs. And then I think the delivery of the performance, I think it's got to be like probably a close second.
Yes. And
particularly if they want to have a career in touring.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that point of, what are the two main elements of the music business? Artist and audience.
Right.
And how we've talked before on this show about, the elements of you have to have an audience to play to.
Exactly.
Music and music careers don't exist in a vacuum. So
absolutely. I thought also the interesting thing was talking about the dark period that she went through after the Capitol Records departure, after Gary Gersh and that whole regime had left. And, typically what happens with people like that when they're so caught up in something that it's like it takes it, it's almost like the rug being pulled from under you.
Yes.
And then going through that depression. And I think she was dealing with other demons.
She was. She talked about her drinking. She talked about getting sober.
Right.
A lot of times, and this is especially true when you're young. I know for me, when I got clean and sober, I was a heavy cocaine user myself. And, when you stop that, there is that period of, adjustment and, having to do things differently and having to live your life in a different kind of way. And she spoke about that dark period, and she spoke about not having a job, and she spoke about her mother passing and having to deal with that sober.
At the same time. Exactly.
Not by falling back on the drink, And
then like everything, like the Phoenix Rising, her figuring out, her warrior spirit and her coming out of that,
Exactly. And what she had to do that. And I thought it was interesting along those lines when she spoke about, she discovered her warrior spirit within her, and that, ultimately she is a survivor.
Right.
And how she was willing to do whatever it took. She said, I took a dog walking job at the time.
Exactly.
I mean, we've all been there, whether it's, I remember not during that period of time, but, whatever it took when I was young, taking dishwashing jobs and just doing whatever it takes to make it work.
Right.
That's what I got from that. I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, and then I thought also, too, when we talked about her best experience in management, which was obviously the whole process of her making the record with June Carter Cash and that process.
You know what I thought was so interesting about that process? And this is a really important kind of thing, because it wasn't spoken about in the interview, but I'm going to sort of extrapolate from that, is that when you're in this business for a long time, like she has been, and she touched upon it briefly, there is a difference between working and a great deal of satisfaction with new up-and-coming bands that you can help break, like she did with Guns N' Roses, and you can be part of that escalating journey.
Right.
But there is a difference between that and working with somebody who's an established artist, reestablish themselves with, helping to pick. So she was essentially like an executive producer on
picking
that
out the songs,
working with June on material, picking out the songs, hiring the producer, getting that project made, keeping it moving along. I mean, there's a lot of work. Eric, you've made records before.
Right.
You know the kind of work creatively that goes into, arrangements, ideas, songs, production, getting the studio schedule,
of songs, everything.
Exactly, all of that.
Yeah.
And how there is a difference between doing that with a brand new artist and doing that with somebody who's a legend like June Carter Cash.
Right.
And I thought that was
taking it to a Grammy nomination and win.
A win, exactly. And seeing that to fruition, it's a very interesting kind of feeling. Very interesting kind of feeling.
Hey Insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at mubutv.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show over at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes in our space. You can also find us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Insider Video Series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. This show would not be here if it weren't for our amazing team, which are the following: interview editors Sarah Nissenbaum and Alex Taylor, show notes and transcriptions by Jani Chang, Nicole Capodoglo, Lilia Owens, and Sarah Nissenbaum, theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Insider Podcast.